Hello, I'm Mike Wolf from db&w, and this is an overview of the Spline tools that we added to the db&w tools in July 2019. I'll walk you through the individual plugins and show you what they do. First of all, I've added a db&w menu here with all the tools. This is also included in the zip files that you all got. And the Spline Toolkit currently consists of 3 plugins that you can add to the menu. One is Add Spline. That's located in the db&w Spline Tools section in the command list. There's Spline Prefs, which is also in the command list, and Spline Edit, which you can find in the Tools section of the command list. So let's start. Add Spline basically adds a null object and attaches the db&w Spline primitive to it. And this is essentially a container for a Bezier spline. If you look at the object properties of that null, you will see that here it says primitive type is a db&w spline. This is where you have the OpenVDB and the native shape volumetric primitives. You can load and save presets. You can change the spline to being open or closed. When it's closed, it's a loop. And you can override some of the defaults that you can set in the prefs, and more on that later. So now that we have created a spline, we see that there's nothing there because there's no spline points. So we activate the Spline Edit tool. This should be activated when the spline primitive is selected. And nothing changed either. And if we now click on the viewport, you will notice that there's a green frame around it. The green frame designates the currently active viewport for the tool. This is the one that you're working in. And you also get this viewport menu. Now, as soon as you start to click in the viewport and drag, it will create the first knot of the spline. And by dragging, you can already control the out control point for the spline knot. Now I just release, click somewhere else and drag, and you can see that this way you can already specify the shape of the spline. Click and drag, click and drag, click and drag. Now this is the edit and append mode, which means that you can edit any of the control points in the spline. And if you click somewhere else, it will create a new point. That's the append section. And this way you can quickly draw a spline. However, just clicking somewhere and adding a point could be dangerous. So let me just turn this off. Now you're just in the edit mode. Now if I click around, it doesn't add a new knot to the spline. You can just select the existing ones and work on those. Now every knot, once you select it, shows you the input and the in and the out control point. They're color coded. The cyan color is used for the in point, the purple for the out point, and the same is actually true for the spline itself, where you have purple for the end point and cyan for the starting point. And you can either move any of these around using the points themselves, or you can use the handles, the axis handles like this, and there's even planar handles, which basically constrain the movement to a plane. Also, to select a knot, you can use the previous knot and next knot buttons. And as you see, this will actually loop through all the knots and loop through when you're at the end of the spline, jump back to the beginning. Now, for every knot, you can either control the smoothness or the curve shape through the knot by using the control points, but you can also, by using automatic, either automatically make it a smooth knot, or if you click on it again, a linear knot, which is essentially a hard edge. And this essentially changes the control points, which define the shape through the knot automatically, depending on the position of the knot and the one before and after it. You can also, if a knot is automatic, in this case smooth, You can press on the smooth or on the linear button to change whether you want the automatic smoothing to be linear or smooth. Also, if automatic is off and you're back to editing the control points, you can press on smooth to get a smooth transition, which just changes the position of the control points, or linear, which also changes the position of the control points. To add new knots, you have insert before and insert after. And again, the direction of what is before and what is after is something you can get from the color coding of the control points. And you can also delete knots by pressing on the delete button here. Now, all of these buttons or options are also available via a right-click menu. And if you press the N button, you also get a standard light wave panel that includes all the options as well. So you have a choice of what you would like to use. Unfortunately, as much as we would have liked to, there is no way to use keyboard shortcuts or even modifiers like Shift, Control, Alt within a tool that we know of. So everything has to be done via buttons and menus. So let's move forward to editing the actual control points. So as you see now, if I move the in control point, it will also move the out control point. This is because both of these are linked. The link control points option is on. If it's off, then it basically breaks them apart and you can move them separately of each other without affecting the other one. Also, when you move the control points directly, not via the handles, but directly, you have the option of either having a free move, which is what's happening now. I can move it anywhere I want to. You can only move the length, which means that you can move the length of the control point or the distance of the control point to the knot, but you can't change the direction. The other option is angle only, where you can only change the direction to the knot, but not the length. And both of these options also work if the control points are linked. So I'm at direction only, and you can see I can't really change the length. If I go to length only, then I can only change the length, but I can't change the direction. The Spline Edit tool also has a complete undo stack. So everything you've done, including adding, removing points, moving the control points, all of this is an undo stack. So you can undo all the way back and undo all the changes that you have made. And this goes way back. You can also redo them unless you have performed an edit, then there is no redo stack anymore. There's also preferences, and these are global preferences for all the splines in your current scene. And I'll go into these a little bit later. If we go to the panel, there's a few more options there. So the edit tab is identical. On the top you have the edit mode, you have the spline open, spline closed, next knot, previous knot. You also have the ability to numerically change the values of the knots if you want to. There you go. And you have some basic settings for the tools, or for the tool. You can turn the individual handles on and off. You can turn the axis handles and the planar handles on and off if you want to. Also, you have the option of the tool displaying the numerical position of the point you're working on as a distance to the origin along 3 axes. You can also turn off the viewport menu here if that's in your way and you're perfectly fine using the right-click menu or this panel. And there's also an option to change the way undos work. By default, the spline tool consolidates undos, which means that identical operations to the same object will be consolidated to one item on the stack. So, for example, if I grab this point and I move it a little bit, move it a bit more, move it over there, and move it back down, then maybe over here. And if I undo it now, then all of these moves will be consolidated into one position change, and the point will move back to the initial point before I started moving it, which is this. The other option is if you turn consolidate undo is off, and I move to the right, and I move up, and I move left, and I move down, and I move somewhere else. Now every undo step will be each of these individual moves that I just made. So there's one move, second move, third move, fourth move, and now we're back at the original position. Usually consolidate undos is perfectly fine. If you go to the Spline Preferences now, you will see the evaluation steps, and that's the amount of pre-computed positions along a span being the spline between two knots. So this is the first span, this is the second one, this is the third one, and currently the Spline Toolkit pre-computes directions along each span to be used later on by the motion plugins. And this is the amount of steps per span. If you find that your orientation is too coarse or there's some jumpiness in there, you can try increasing the amount of steps. The selected steps is essentially the amount of lines the plugin is using to draw the spline into the viewport. This does not affect the evaluation of it by other plugins. It's just for visualization in the viewports. So if we look at these points, you will see, I think it's visible now, that the spline is actually drawn using various lines, and you can make it a little bit finer by just changing the setting here, and you see that the corners here are gone. Selected steps is for a spline that's currently selected. Deselected is for a spline that's not selected. This is essentially to save resources both in CPU time and memory. So if you have many splines in your scene, but you only want to focus on the one you're actually working on, you can turn down the deselected steps because you don't really care about how they look in the viewport at that moment. Also, selected width and deselected width does the same thing, except that it allows you to change the width of the lines that the spline is being drawn with. 8 is the maximum I can use, and the default here is 1.5 for selected one and 1.0 for deselected splines, so it's a little bit less visible. And if I drop the tool now, you use the spacebar to drop the tool or switch to another one like move, translate. If I drop the tool, you will also see that for selected spline, knots are being drawn as small circles, so you know where the knots are. And you can turn their visibility on and off. And you also have a separate option for the start and end knots, and turn these off as well with a different color, or turn them off completely. You can also change the starting and the end color that's used both here to display the spline and also used for the control points. Show normals is an option that shows you the orientation along that spline. So if you would like to align an object to the direction of the spline, then the normals show you how it is going to be oriented. And the colors used here for the axes are the normal ones that Lightwave uses for X, Y, and Z. And you can either show all the normals, and these are all the normals computed by the evaluation steps. Or if that's too busy for you, you can just show the normals for the knots. And yes, these spline preferences are saved with the scene. And that also includes some of the tool preferences that are also saved with the scene. And of course, the online help on all the panels goes to the respective page on our wiki. So now that we have created a spline, let's just move to, it's the wrong scene. Let's just move to actually moving an item along the spline. So what I have here is I've got this arrow. And in the motion options, there is a plugin called db&w Spline Motion. And I'm going to take the arrow and attach it to the green spline. That's the open spline. And as you can see, it actually moves along that spline. Here we go. So the options you have in the Spline Motion plugin is you can first of all select one of the available splines. You have a displacement, which is a percentage to position your item along the spline. In this case, it's from 0% to 100% at the end of the sequence, where 0% is the beginning of the spline and 100% is the end of it. You also have two different kinds of displacement types, which define how that percentage is interpreted. By default, it's the complete spline, so 0%, again, start of the spline, 100% end of the spline. If the displacement type is per span, then 100% will be the position of the first knot. 200% will be the position of the third knot, and 300% will be the position of the fourth knot. The per span option essentially allows you to precisely position an object on one of the spline knots. Use twist allows you to use the twist value that you can define in the Spline Edit tool, which gives you a rotation about the direction at every knot, so you can adjust the orientation along the spline. There's also an option to use a look ahead, which just works just like a normal motion options look ahead, except that in this case you don't get a distance, but a look ahead displacement, which is essentially the same percentage that we would use up here. And it's essentially a percentage that's being added to the position at the current displacement. And that's being used to evaluate a target point. So if I really crank it up, then you will notice as we move through that the arrow all of a sudden points somewhere completely different, but still on a position that's on the spline. You also have the option of evaluating the spline in world coordinates, which wouldn't make a difference here because the spline is just at the origin, but if I move it somewhere else, let's go to the first frame. If I move it somewhere else and maybe even rotate it a bit, and then go back to my arrow, you will see that right now, because world coordinates is off, the arrow still follows the spline, but the spline as it would be at the origin. If you turn on world coordinates, then it is going to follow the spline where it is positioned in the world. You also have the option for the position for the X, Y, and Z, and for the heading to either replace the existing motion of the object with the spline, or to ignore the spline position or rotation. You can add the spline rotation or position to the existing values that have been keyframed, or you can even multiply it when it comes to positions. Also, one option that you have, I'll just load a different scene here. This is using the node, which essentially works the same way, except that you also have numerical inputs for the position and the rotation. Otherwise, it's identical to the motion. In this case, we have 3 arrows. And they all have a displacement that goes from minus 300 to plus 300%. And they're using the complete spline displacement mode. Now, the top spline is using a pre-behavior of hold and a post-behavior of hold, which basically means if the displacement is below 0%, then it's going to hold the position at the beginning of the spline. If it's above 100%, then it's going to hold the position at the end of the spline. The second arrow, that's this one here, is using the loop option, which basically means that once the arrow reaches the end of the spline and it goes beyond 100%, then it will go back to the beginning of the spline. So it just loops through the motion like this. And the third spline here, or the third arrow here, is using the pre and post behavior of mirror, which basically means if the displacement percentage is below 0 or above 100%, then the movement will essentially ping pong and it will move to and fro. So yes, these are the basics of the spline tools. There's still a few minor things that need to be worked on. For example, the orientation along the spline isn't quite working the way we would like it to. But yes, this should give you an idea of how it works, and you can certainly use it already, even though some things are definitely going to change in the future. But we still hope that you like what we've developed so far, with your help, of course. And we would like to take this opportunity to certainly thank all of our patrons, not only for their support on Patreon, but also for the nice discussions that we've been having on Discord and the feature requests. And we would like to encourage all patrons that aren't on Discord to join our Discord server. So yeah, that's it for now. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.